Okay, I think we can start now, and if people will join later, they will see the presentation anyway. Maybe I'll ask those who are not talking to mute themselves. So this is a rapid press briefing for the release of our fifth new report. You can see already on the screen, it's about climate impacts and fishing industry profits from new fuel tax subsidies, a subject matter that has not been studied that much. Just for your information, this briefing is being recorded and will be shared afterwards, probably with the press release. We will have two presentations today, one from Rebecca Hubbard at Our Fish, and one from Grace O'Sullivan, member of the European Parliament. Rebecca is the director of Our Fish, and Grace is an MEP active in the PESH committee and ENVI committee. So as I said before, the intention of the briefing is to emulate a face-to-face press briefing. So when there is question and answer, feel free to intervene and to put questions, raising the hand or put question in the chat. So just to give you background to the report. So the release of this report is also very timely because the Energy Taxation Directive is currently being reviewed. And this is the piece of legislation where actually there is an obligation for the moment to exempt fisheries from paying fuel taxes. And it is reviewed, this Energy Taxation Directive is reviewed in line with the requirements of the EU Green Deal and the climate law. And fuel taxes subsidies is an item in this context. The Commission has already made a proposal for the revision as part of the Fit for 55 package of the legislation. And since it is a tax file, this revision will only go through basically the Council. There will only be a position of the Parliament, but which is not binding on the Council. So now I will hand over to Rebecca Hubbard, the Program Director with Our Fish, to present the findings of the report. Very exciting. So go ahead, Beck. Beck, you're still muted.
Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't find my cursor. Thank you, Flaminia. And hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I think that Dave's still chasing a couple of journalists who are on their way, but we'll get started because this is intended to be short and sharp. So yes, as Flaminia says, we have produced this report and this is what we're going to be introducing today. And then Grace will talk about the European Parliament's position on these subsidies, regardless of whether or not they get a chance to officially decide on the Energy Taxation Directive. So just for a little bit of context, with regards to fisheries and the EU, there has been no fuel tax for the EU fishing industry since 2003. In fact, they are not allowed to tax fuel for the fishing industry. The problem with that is that fuel tax subsidies reduce the cost of fishing, which increases capacity and overfishing. And this is a fairly well-known concept. There's a quote here from the World Bank, specifically around the fact that, you know, these subsidies enable fishing to continue even when it's not economic, which obviously undermines the fisheries management models and has quite dramatic effects. And I'm sure that Grace will talk a little bit about that, and I'll cover a little bit more of that. The OECD also has some really interesting and extensive information around the impacts of fuel tax subsidies on overfishing and on the fishing industry. The issue with these subsidies and with the problem that they exacerbate and worsen overfishing is that the EU has still not ended overfishing, even though by EU law, we should have ended overfishing by 2020 at the latest. And the majority of EU fish stocks remain overfished. As well, EU seas are the most heavily trawled in the world. Just going to admit someone, so I just let someone, hi Niall. So another little bit of context for this conversation and this report is that obviously we're all aware that we have a biodiversity and climate crisis, and the role and impact of subsidies on that is extremely unhelpful. So fishing has an impact on the blue carbon, or the ocean's carbon system, in a number of ways, through impacting the seabed, through the burning of fuel when fishing, and through the removal of fish and marine life in the ocean. As has been recently reported, trawling at a global level produces the equivalent amount of CO2 emissions as the aviation industry by the resuspension of carbon in the seabed. So just the impact on the seabed is the equivalent, produces the equivalent amount of CO2 emissions as the aviation industry. And yet the EU is using public money to subsidise the burning of fuels, and therefore incentivising CO2 pollution. So obviously this is a real challenge, because it really undermines and makes it much more difficult for the EU to deliver on its commitments to the Paris Agreement, to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and obviously to the EU climate law. So as part of the EU's ambition to reach climate neutrality, we have this Fit for 55 package, and as Flaminia introduced, the revision of the Energy Taxation Directive is a part of that package of legislation. And in order for that to really do its job and minimise CO2 pollution as much as possible, as quickly as possible, removing subsidies is absolutely crucial. So in terms of the report, what I'm going to run through is what we've done with the report, and to show actually how many subsidies have been paid out over the last 10 years for the EU fishing fleet. We've based this, so we have an executive summary report and then a full report which has the methodology and the references in much more detail. But essentially the question is, how do you tax fuel? Because it hasn't been taxed before. So what we did is we provide a range of potential taxation for fuels, and that's based on both the EU Council directive, which is a guide for tax on motor fuels, and then we have as our minimum rate of tax, and then we provide an upper rate of tax, which is based on actual tax rates that have been applied by member states for gas oil for road transport over the last 10 years. So that's from around 33 cents a litre to 67 cents a litre is the tax rate. Now, what the European Commission has proposed with its Energy Taxation Directive for the fishing fleet is just 3.5 cents a litre. So it's essentially about 1/10 of what would be 1/10 or even 1/20 of what would be a reasonable and equitable tax rate. And all of this fuel consumption and whatnot the numbers come from this annual economic report of the EU fishing fleet. So it's the latest figures that we've got access to. So as an overview, each year the EU fleet burns 2.3 billion litres of fuel, which produces 7.3 million tonnes of carbon dioxide, which enables them to avoid between 759 million euros and 1.5 billion euros in taxes. So that is, for equivalence, the same amount of CO2 as Malta produced in 2019. This is the EU fishing fleet. I think many people don't think of the fishing fleets as being particularly polluting, but I think that's a fairly large amount. In terms of the amount of money that they're saving or avoiding or receiving in public funds, 750 to 1.5 billion euros is equivalent to 32,000, more or less, annual salaries paid at 4,000 euros a month. So it's quite a lot of money, quite obviously, and it's quite a lot of carbon pollution. So we've got 5 case studies in the report based on really importance of the fleets, or economic influence, or destructive potential. The Spanish demersal trawl fleet is one of those. It's around 900 vessels, and really it's one of the most destructive in terms of its environmental impacts, but also in terms of its carbon impacts. For the year of 2000, the numbers on the left are the total for 10 years. So the fleet is around 900 vessels now. But, over 10 years, they've avoided 1.2 to 2.5 billion euros in taxes, the Spanish demersal trawl fleet. And this is the same trawl fleet that also obviously has an impact, as I said before, on the seabed and the seabed's capacity to store that carbon. So this is not their only, that's the money that they've saved, but in terms of the carbon emissions, which is 12 million tonnes over 10 years, that's not their full carbon budget. That's just what they're burning in fuel. So they're also having an impact on that seabed as well, and we don't have figures for that right now. So that's a fairly enormous amount, and a fairly enormous impact. And just to demonstrate, I guess, the lost opportunity that the Commission has presented with its proposed ETD review, their tax rate would only tax 134 million over that 10 years instead of 1.2 to 2.5 billion. So I'm not going to talk through all 5, but I also just wanted to show these 2 case studies next to each other. On the left, we've got the Dutch pelagic trawl fleet, which has currently 7 vessels in it. And on the right, we have the Italian vessels under 12 meters using polyvalent gear. So they're generally like low impact, what you would call small scale, low impact fleet. And the Dutch are the really big industrial trawlers. So there's 7,000 Italian small vessels and 7 large Dutch trawlers. The 7 Dutch trawlers use more fuel and produce more CO2 in that 10 years than the 7,000 Italian vessels. And those 7 vessels are owned by a handful of companies, probably less than a handful, and they've saved themselves or cost the EU public between 225 and 456 million euros. And that's just a handful of companies, whereas 7,000 fishermen or fishers on the right have avoided the same amount of tax. But if you split that by 7,000, it's a whole lot less of a profit or a benefit. So we also do a comparison or an analysis on Portuguese longliners and French purse seiners, also because they're quite small fleets, but quite impactful in the sense that they go a long way, they burn a lot of fuel, and some of them target some quite sensitive species. So you can read about those in the report. Just to mention here that because they fish offshore and in distant waters, the Commission in their Energy Taxation Directive proposed that European fleets only pay the fuel tax if they leave and return to European ports or land their fish in European ports or something. It's a little bit vague as to exactly where and how they're going to get taxed. So in some cases, even though these guys have saved between 30 and 38 and 98 million euros in 10 years in fuel tax, the Commission is proposing that they pay between nothing and 5 million. So it's really, you know, we're really giving away, we're really paying the fishing fleet to pollute here. So just to wrap up, the climate benefits of taxing fuel for the fishing industry, I mean, at this stage, every tonne of CO2 counts. The latest IPCC report was very clear about that, where really things are very serious. So by removing all tax exemptions, we can both directly benefit, have the direct benefit of having the most fuel intensive fleets being taxed and costing the most and being the most impacted, and the indirect benefit of some of the same fleets who have a lot of CO2 emissions from impacting the seabed would also be quite heavily impacted. And of course, we would increase the member state budget by funding, and which could then fund a just transition to a low carbon and low impact industry and deliver on those EU climate laws. And the ocean benefits are similar in the sense of increasing budgets to fund a transition to a sustainable fleet, and again, decreasing overfishing, obviously increasing the ocean's capacity to mitigate and adapt to climate change as well, and helping small scale, low impact fishers. And I'll leave it there. I'm sorry, I went a bit over time.
Thank you, Beck. Thank you very much. We're going to move quickly onto Grace O'Sullivan's intervention, because Grace O'Sullivan needs to leave probably around 5:30. So I pass the word straight to you, Grace. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Flaminia, and thanks, Rebecca, very much for your report, and thanks to all your colleagues and the team at Our Fish, because this is really important to have these findings and have this kind of data, and this comparative data as well will be very useful in terms of this discussions around fisheries and subsidies and taxation and the rest of it. From my own perspective, well, firstly, I'm Grace O'Sullivan to the people who are attending, and I'm coming from Ireland today, and I'm a member of the PESH committee in the European Parliament, and a Green member and EFA member at that. So from our perspective, the environmental harmful subsidies, they just must be phased out. And this was supported by my colleagues in the European Parliament recently. The phase out, we recognise, will not be easy, but it is a phase out at any rate. And it will be critically important that all sectors play their part. And that's why I think it's really important today that Rebecca has highlighted a very important sector, which is the fisheries sector, very important to the EU. You know, sometimes there might be the perception that the fishing industry operates almost, or can be left outside of the radar. But I think in terms of climate change and the whole blue sector, it's really important that we acknowledge the role that the fishing sector can play. For the sector, it's important to stress that the most destructive fishing fleets, such as the demersal trawlers, also emit CO2, and Rebecca referred to that. And you know, we have to consider everything in the context of the recent IPCC report, where they raised the red flag for humanity. So you know, there's no better time to act than now, and in fact we have to get on with it. So again, the report will certainly help us in the Parliament to support our arguments. So what I'd like to file that I'm working on, which is the 8th Environment Action Programme, and this is a legislative file, and it's currently being negotiated by the Parliament, Council and the Committee at trilogue stage, and it deals with the issue of harmful subsidies more generally. And I'm sure some of you will be aware of these environment action programs. This is the 8th one, there was the 7th, 6th and so on, but they are the overarching framework program for environmental policy from now until 2030. So the 8th Environment Action Programme goes from now until 2030. And as you know too, this, we have been told by the UN and many others that this is the crucial decade for change. So that's why this piece of legislation is really important. And we recognise that the Commission's flagship, the European Green Deal, is hugely welcome, and it was a great start to this mandate for the parliamentarians, the Commission and the Council. But it is a communication. It isn't a legislative file, as is the 8th Environment Action Programme. So I think that's why it's really important that we recognise the power of the 8th Environment Action Programme in terms of setting out that vision in a legislative way. And then the 8th Environment Action Programme, it deals with environment policy, but also lists conditions that must be met to achieve the objectives. And the Commission's proposal lists phasing out environmentally harmful subsidies as one of these conditions. So, I mean, that's good that the Commission have already, there was broad agreement between the Commission, Council and the Parliament, also that environmental harmful subsidies would be phased out. But from my mandate now, which I received a very strong majority in the Parliament in July to support the report, which actually adds concrete dates for the phase out of environmentally harmful subsidies. And we feel that these dates must be included in the 8th Environment Action Programme, because without dates, we won't reach deadlines, and we won't have the certainty and the legally binding obligation to phase out environmentally harmful subsidies. So for us, it's really critically important that we have these dates. And the first one that we specified was the fossil fuel subsidies. And the date that we have agreed in the European Parliament and have the support is 2025. And just to highlight that it's a phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies. And the other date we specified was 2027, which is for other environmentally harmful subsidies. And again, that's a phase out up to 2027. And once again, I just want to iterate the point that we are in a climate and biodiversity emergency. We have the data to support that. We see the evidence across the globe. We see it within Europe over this summer. So that's why for us, it is pertinent that we have these dates and that we don't just have a broad intention, but we can now specify something, and hopefully we'll get the agreement of the Council and the Commission to that. The second point is the Parliament has added an obligation for the Commission to identify harmful subsidies. So this is because, again, we want to be specific. We want to be smart and specific. And currently there's not a consensus on what could or is considered environmentally harmful subsidies. So again, we want that specified. And again, in terms of our fish and the report, you are specific in your information in the report, and that's what we want in the 8th Environment Action Programme. We want specifics now, clear deadlines and targets that we can work for towards, and we want and we recognise that there's also a lack of definition when it comes to the arguments of phasing out fossil fuels. So this has to be tackled. We want clear definitions as to what we're talking about. You know, I mean, we're still in discussions around that, but that's our objective, to try and get those into the 8th Environment Action Programme. The third point is the Parliament has added an annual reporting obligation by member states on their progress in terms of phasing out environmentally harmful subsidies. There's 2 points of importance with regard to this. One is the transparency, and one is the tracking of the progress that is being made. So this is, again, hugely important given the scale of the crises we're currently in. So where are we in terms of the trilogue? We've just started there 2 weeks ago, the beginning of the trilogue with the Parliament, with the Council and with the Commission. There's a very, as I said, there's very strong mandate from the Parliament, so that's quite good from my perspective in driving forth the arguments I just pointed out earlier. And now it's up to the member state governments in the Council and the Commission to show that they're serious about their statements in the support of climate action. So they've already said, as I said, in the 70th Environment Action Programme, they've already, in many papers, they have said that they want to agree to end to the phasing out of environmentally harmful subsidies, and particularly because of climate change. So now we want to see that they're committed to do this, so that it's not just a general statement, it's not just some kind of a broad commitment. They made it in the 17th EAP and Environmental Action Programme, and they didn't keep to it. So what we want to really do now is to get the dates and agreement on those. And again, you know, it's obvious that, and as Rebecca said, I mean, public money is being spent on activities that are actually accelerating the whole, the warming of the planet, the warming of the seas, the impact on the fish, the very fish that the fishers are trying to catch to provide the food for our tables are being impacted by these supports being given, which are actually driving and accelerating climate change. So as I said earlier, we recognise it won't be easy. We recognise that we need to get on with it in earnest now, and it is recognised that it will be a transition. But you know, for someone like myself who's been involved in environmental activism and campaigning through many years, you know, we really, the transition can't be too long, because it's at the cost of the earth and the health of the planet and the health of us humans as a species. So we need to really get on with it. And as Rebecca said, the subsidies need to be redirected to actions that will decrease our greenhouse gas emissions. That's without doubt. Rebecca talked about the fuel, but also talked about that report that came out a few months ago, the impact of fishing and trawling, particularly on the release of CO2 emissions. So the bottom line for us is that we will not achieve the goals of of the EU climate law or the Paris Agreement or the SDGs if we don't end the subsidies. So my work in the Parliament will be to work to effectively negotiate as best as I can a deal with the other colleagues in the Council and the Commission to try to get a binding commitment to dates to stop the harmful subsidies. So I will leave it at that at the moment. And Rebecca, I don't know if you want to come in on that or if there's any questions at this stage, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Grace. I don't know how much time is left for you. For those who have questions for Grace, maybe it should be immediately because Grace has to leave us quickly. Otherwise, we will stay another couple of minutes to discuss the report. So please raise your hand if you want to ask questions to Grace. Okay, Dave, yes, go ahead.
Just a quick one from me. In the chat, I'm adding a link to the, the full report, the executive summary of the report, and a draft press release that needs to be completed. All of this is under embargo until just after midnight on Monday morning, the 20th of September. Any questions, drop me an email, and I think all of you have my contacts.
Maybe to
Flamina,
add,
yeah,
yes.
Maybe I can just add that, I mean, if there are no questions, if at this stage, if anyone has questions later, they can certainly contact my office at grace.o'sullivan@ep.europa.eu, and we would be happy to engage or provide information to anyone who's listening in.
Yes, and maybe it also makes sense to remind that there are two upcoming big international events that are linked to fuel subsidies. One is the WTO negotiation that is coming up on the elimination of fisheries harmful subsidies. And then at the end of October, there is the G20, where the biggest economies in the world need to meet up and discuss also the elimination of fuel subsidies. So I think that this is a theme that will be covered several times in the upcoming month, and it is extremely relevant, yeah, for achieving all the objectives that we have to combat climate change.
Well, then if there's no questions from me, I will bow out and head off to my next meeting, and just thank our fish and everyone very, very much, and to you, Flamina, for moderating the discussion. So thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no questions, I mean, the report is also full of data that maybe need time to be digested. So I'm sure that you can come back to Dave and back to ask questions more precisely to certain data that are displayed in the report.
Absolutely. I mean, if anybody has any just general questions, they can turn their camera on and ask as well.
Yes, Nat.
Hi, can you hear me and see me okay?
Yes, go ahead. Now, no. Maybe you need to turn off the camera.
Unfortunately, no. So, those who don't know me, I'm editor of the Skipper magazine. Hi, can you hear me now? Yeah? Okay. Right. So I'm Niall Duffy, I'm editor of the Skipper magazine. And what I just wanted to know is, obviously I haven't read the report yet. And until I read the report, it's hard to comment on it. But there's a few things there which raise a few flags with me. One, I don't know, can Rebecca or maybe Dave answer this? Is there any acknowledgement in the report that fishing has the lowest CO2 footprint of any protein production? The other thing is the impact on the seabed that this report keeps over the last maybe 2-3 months, keeps being highlighted of the impact on the seabed. As far as I'm aware, that report hasn't been properly peer reviewed yet. and we've been looking at it as well to try and determine. That was one study done off the coast of Spain by a German, one of the German institutes, and as far as I'm aware, it hasn't properly been peer reviewed yet, and the findings haven't been parsed and challenged yet. So it's been quoted in this report. I mean, there's a couple of things there where you mentioned the Dutch fleet of 7 vessels. It's back to this thing of the CO2 emissions of them per volume of fish landed is probably one of the lowest. There's a lot different types of fish and have a different impact. And is there any acknowledgement that with the demersal fleet, especially, they have used things like using alternative to steel warps, lighter nets, and that to reduce their fuel consumption and reduce the CO2 impact. So it just seems to be, there seems to be just a one size fits all here as regards fishing. And the removal of any subsidy will affect all the different fleets, from the smallest boat using an outboard engine up to the largest super trawler. So I don't know if Dave or Rebecca would like to comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Niall. No, it's true that essentially, because there, I mean, as you say, there's different fleets that use different gears and burn different volumes of fuel. And of course, you know, we basically used peer-reviewed other studies to formulate an approach to, okay, how much CO2 do they burn per litre of fuel? So we've used like another study as the basis for that calculation, and that's in the full report. So you should read the full report, not the summary, because you'll want to read that level of detail. And again, of course, like it is definitely, we've put out these numbers which are based on the numbers that come from you know, that economic report, that come from this other peer-reviewed study, that look at, you know, for example, the tax rate that the Taxation Directive, you know, provides as guidance. It hasn't been done before. So what we're presenting here is like, this is what it could have been, but the fact is that they've paid absolutely nothing in fuel tax for not just 10 years, 18 years. We've calculated what they've not paid in 10 years. Now, it could be slightly less, it could be slightly more. You know, we definitely haven't got down to, you know, which gear is being used by which one. The point that this report is making is that there's a very large amount of money that is not being paid in fuel tax by anybody in the fishing industry. And all EU citizens are expected to pay tax on the fuel when they're driving a car around. But the fishing industry isn't expected to pay tax while they're driving their boats around. And the fact is, we're in a climate emergency. We need to decarbonise everywhere. Every single tonne of CO2 counts. This has been made very, very clear. And we are not going to decrease the amount of CO2 that we use if we're effectively paying people to burn fuel. So that's the key thrust of, you know, of the message of the report. In terms of, you know, this seabed impacts in terms of CO2, like carbon resuspension and those figures, that report is from Enrique Sala and a number of other scientists. It is peer reviewed, and I can get you the link to the article. But as I said, we don't include those calculations in our report. We're only looking at fuel use, so we're not looking at the impact on the carbon cycle, the entire ocean carbon cycle at all. Actually, we're just looking at the fuel that's being used, not what's happening in the ocean in terms of seabed carbon storage or carbon removal through the impact on the fish populations. So we don't extensively assess that and quantify that in this report. In terms of the different fleets, or in terms of, oh, that's right, that's what your thing was, about the kind of climate or carbon footprint of seafood. So I just think your comment that seafood or fish is the lowest carbon footprint of all protein is actually incorrect, and it has been, well, at least there's definitely, I've seen at least one study on that, in the sense that, you know, as you've rightly pointed out, there's very different forms of fishing that have different impacts, right? So some of them have very low, you know, litres of fuel consumed to produce kilos of fish, and some have higher ones. So as you would know, bottom trawling uses more fuel per kilo of fish than maybe a line fisherman would, and potentially even some of those industrial trawlers, because they catch such enormous quantities. But that's not the only carbon impact, I guess. And there's definitely a number of studies that show that things like you know, prawn trawlers and some other things actually have a bigger CO2 footprint than some land-based proteins. So it's not, definitely not a like all seafood is great or all land animals are bad, or, and we're not saying all fishing is bad. We're saying the fishing fleet in the EU has paid no tax on its fuel, and we're now in a climate emergency, and we can't keep allowing companies, particularly as you mentioned, the Dutch pelagic trawlers. I mean, they are some of the most profitable and richest fishing companies in Europe, possibly in the world, and they've saved hundreds of millions of euros by not paying fuel tax over the last 10 years.
Thanks, Beck. Does someone have other questions? Otherwise, I think we can close the press briefing. And yeah, you can get in contact with Dave and Beck for any further question, or Niall, if you want to have more exchanges on that. I'm sure Dave and Beck will be available for you. Thank you very much all for attending, and thank you for this great report, Beck and Dave. And yeah, have a nice end of the afternoon.
Thanks, Flaminia. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.